Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Two issues that are very important to me are those that pertain to the Constitution and those that pertain to immigration. So anytime I can have somebody on that can talk intelligently about both, it's an honor. And today's guest can absolutely do it. He's a professor of law at George Mason University and the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Professor Ilya Somin, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, what is Operation Lone Star?
So, as I understand it, it's a set of policies by which Texas, on its own, without endorsement or cooperation even from federal authorities, is trying to reduce undocumented immigration across the southern border. And some of the policies involved are likely illegal under federal law. Others may be problematic for other kinds of reasons.
So, among other things that we've heard a lot about is they've put up what's it, concertina wire or
Yes.
razor wire, basically, to stop people from coming in. There's also, from what I understand, National Guard troops like in parks and things of that nature. So, how has the federal government responded to this?
So there have been a number of different policies which have drawn different kinds of responses. In some instances, the federal government is arguing, sometimes correctly, that these policies are illegal under federal law, and the cases have gone to court. One of them involves the concertina wire, where federal CBP officials have cut the wire so that they could gain access to migrants crossing a border and process them and deal with them. A lower court, a trial court issued an injunction barring the federal officials from cutting the wire, but then the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit overturned that injunction and said the federal officials were within their rights to cut the wire. And since then, the Supreme Court has refused to lift the Fifth Circuit's reversal of that injunction, thus letting the federal officials continue to cut the wire if they so choose. In another case, Texas has put up water buoys in the middle of the Rio Grande River. They claim in an attempt to stop border crossing. The federal government has sued, arguing that this violates the Federal Rivers and Harbors Act, which bars the placement of obstacles to navigation in navigable waters. Both a district court and a Fifth Circuit panel has ruled that was indeed illegal, but that case is now going to be reviewed by the full Fifth Circuit. The big issue in this case that may be much more important than the specific issue of whether placing the buoys is illegal is Texas's argument that even if what they're doing is illegal under federal statutory law, they can still go ahead and do it under the so-called invasion clause of the Constitution, which says that, quote, if a state is actually invaded, then they can, quote, engage in war in response, even without federal government authorization. Normally, only the federal government Congress can authorize war, but here, if illegal migration really qualifies as invasion, then state governments can do it. And then they further say, well, if we can engage in war, then certainly we can place a water buoy in the river. So that issue may be reviewed by the en banc Fifth Circuit. And if that court or the Supreme Court were to endorse this invasion argument, it would set an extremely dangerous precedent. And one also, I think, is contrary to the text and original meaning of the invasion clause, and also just to basic common sense in that migration is not invasion because, as James Madison put it, invasion is an operation of war, and merely crossing a border or smuggling illegal drugs across a border you can argue about whether that's a bad thing, but it is not war, and it's absurd to think that Texas could say it, have the legal right to attack Mexico in response. I would add one other point about this invasion issue, and that is that another provision of the Constitution says that in the event of invasion, the federal government can suspend the writ of habeas corpus. That is that they can detain people without making charges against them, without giving them due process and so forth. Obviously, ever since we've had significant migration restrictions on the southern border, there has never not been a year when there have been hundreds of thousands of illegal border crossers since we've had the war on drugs. There has never not been a year when there's been lots of cross-border illegal drug trafficking. So on this theory, if Texas is correct, then the federal government can suspend a writ of habeas corpus anytime they want. And that seems like a pretty serious threat to civil liberties. The Texas Republicans and other Republicans like to talk about how awful they think Joe Biden is. If he really is that awful, do they really want to give him the power to suspend a writ of habeas corpus anytime he might want to? Which under their theory, he probably could do, though there is a complication in that the Supreme Court has never resolved the issue of whether the suspension power is one that the president can use on his own, as Abraham Lincoln argued during the Civil War, or whether, as Chief Justice Roger Taney argued at that time, that only Congress can do it. But even if only Congress can do it, that still means Congress would be able to do it anytime they want, so long as there is illegal migration or cross-border drug trafficking, which there has always been for the last 80 years or more, and certainly is likely to continue at a large scale indefinitely, so long as we have our current drug and immigration laws.
So you mentioned the invasion. After the court ruled, Abbott, the governor of Texas, basically refused to comply, and he put out, I don't know what, a manifesto. And in this manifesto, he cites Article 1, Section 10 and Article 4, Section 4, the invasion clauses, as you call them. How, and I know you can't know, but based on your knowledge of the Supreme Court, if they get it, how are they likely to decide, and what would be their reasoning either way?
Yeah. So let me say a couple things. First, it is not quite correct to say that he refused to comply, because in the issue in the concertina wire case, which is the one that drew his declaration, that decision actually did not issue any orders to Texas as such. It merely lifted an injunction against the federal government so that now CBP officers are no longer barred from cutting the wire. But it doesn't directly issue any orders to Texas. So at least so far, we do not, in fact, yet at least have a situation where
Okay.
Texas is refusing to comply with a ruling. If the Supreme Court were to get a case like this and they address the invasion argument, I would hope they would see that the text and original meaning and simple common sense say that illegal migration and drug smuggling do not count as invasions because it's contrary to text and original meaning, as James Madison pointed out back in his report of 1800, and also because it would set a very dangerous precedent. I mentioned earlier, it would essentially authorize the federal government to suspend a writ of habeas corpus anytime they want. And it would authorize a border state like Texas to engage in war against Mexico anytime they want. So, never mind, putting a National Guard on the border or putting up some wire. By this standard, Abbott or any other border state governor could send the National Guard to invade Mexico. And it's obviously dangerous to allow a state to have the power to in effect start a war without any congressional authorization.
There is popular, I guess they're influencers that I come across on Twitter, and she fancies herself a constitutional scholar. And she makes this argument that to me seems utterly ridiculous, but I want to run it by you.
Sure.
She says that the federal government is supposed to protect states from invasion. But since the federal government is not protecting them, that the 10th Amendment kicks in and the states are allowed to do it. And I pointed out to her, well, that's actually not what the 10th Amendment says. It doesn't say if the federal government doesn't do something, the states can. It says if the power is not delegated to the federal government nor prohibited to the states, then the power goes to the states and the people. But she's got, roughly, I think, 500,000 followers on Twitter, a lot of people that buy this stuff. So I figured I'd run it by you. Is it as ridiculous as it sounds to me?
If anything, it's even more ridiculous than you said it is, because in addition to the problems you pointed out, it also has the problem that it assumes that illegal migration or drug smuggling qualify as invasion, which is just simply not true. And if it were true, it would have the dire implications that I just mentioned. More generally, Twitter is full of self-appointed experts on different things, many of whom don't actually have the expertise that they claim. This is just one, example on the right. There are obviously examples of this on the left as well. So all I can say is that the mere fact that someone is a Twitter influencer does not necessarily mean that they know what they're talking about.
Well, the same woman says that because we're being invaded right now, that if people house migrants, that it's in violation of the Third Amendment, which prohibits the forced quartering of troops. But it's against quartering your own troops, first of all, not
So
in,
I think
not invading
I
troops.
think this argument is even stupider than the other one. Yes, migrants are not troops, neither are drug smugglers. Secondly, it's against the government forcing you to quarter troops. Even if migrants somehow are troops, if you voluntarily choose to have them in your house or whatnot, that is not forced quartering imposed by the government, and therefore would not be a violation of the Third Amendment. There are probably other problems with this argument as well, but the argument is so ridiculous and stupid that I think mentioning these problems should be enough.
Okay. One point that I think Texas has a strong claim, but they didn't raise it. And I think they don't raise it because it goes against what they want and what most people want. You and I have discussed in the past that the federal government has no authority over immigration unless we're at war with a country, then they can prevent migrants from that country coming into here. Given that the federal government doesn't have any authority over immigration, and given that it's not prevented to the states, then wouldn't the 10th Amendment allow for states to conduct their own immigration policy?
So what you said, I think, is true under the original meaning of the Constitution, as James Madison and others argued. It is not true under current Supreme Court precedent, going back to the Chinese exclusion case of 1889. If hypothetically the Chinese exclusion case and other similar cases were to be overruled, which I would like to see happen, but I don't think is actually going to happen anytime soon, if ever, then it would be true. Then states would have power over immigration. It still would not be the case that a state could engage in war in response, because that is a power that is actually specifically reserved to the federal government, the power to declare war. But they could do things like put up barriers, impose certain kinds of restriction immigration, and indeed, in the early republic, states did do things like that. For instance, some states tried to exclude migrants that they thought would be a burden on the community because they were poor or mentally disabled and the like. Of course, that would also mean that other states would be able to let in as many migrants as they want. And so a more liberal state, or in some cases a conservative state like Utah or Indiana, which has said they want more migrants from their labor force, they would be able to let migrants in. And that result of that would be a much higher level of immigration than we currently have, albeit more to some states than to others. So I think, yes, if we were to return to the original meaning of the Constitution, Texas would be able to restrict migration more than it does so now, though still not to the point of engaging in war. On the other hand, other states would be free to let migrants in. And that's a trade-off that I would be willing to accept. But I think most immigration restrictionists probably would not, because it would result in much higher immigration overall.
Right. And once the immigrants came in, if they came into California, then states can't prevent state to
So
state migration, right?
they could potentially do so under the sort of pre-Civil War understanding of the Constitution. That actually, would be a subject would have to be litigated. But even if Texas legally could try to prevent migrants coming in from Arizona or Nevada or something like that, obviously, as a practical matter, it would not be easy for them to do so. And even if they did do so, there would be lots of states with more liberal immigration policies than perhaps Texas currently under its current government would enact. And therefore, again, the net result would be much more immigration to the United States than right-wing restrictionists, most of them at least, would want to see.
Well, surprisingly, it's not. Well, I don't know if they'd be right wing, but it's not just Republicans that are restrictionist. I'm seeing more and more people calling themselves libertarians or anarcho-capitalists that are arguing for restrictions. And it's so against classical liberal philosophy that you would be arguing these things. But from what I could get, the basic argument is that if all private property was private, then each owner would be able to decide for himself. But given that it's not private, given that there's public land, that it's essentially collectively owned and the will of the people can decide. Now, the problem they have there is 30% of the border is federal property. And if we're going to be constitutionalist, then the federal government can't prevent them from coming in. Also, a lot of that state property. So then, what if California just says, I want to let them in, which I think they probably would as a liberal state, but that's not what these restrictionists want. Are you, first of all, are you familiar with these
Yeah, so
folks?
I actually have a blog post I wrote about a year ago about what I call the public property rationale for immigration restrictions. I should note that when talking about this, we're going way beyond any kind of existing law or constitutional
Yeah,
theory. We're talking
I know
about sort
that.
of first principles of libertarian or classical liberal political thought. And the argument here is that even though the government, perhaps under at least under a libertarian view, should not be allowed to prevent private individuals from having immigrants on their private property, public property is a different situation. So we can do things like, for instance, prevent immigrants from being on the roads or using the airways and so forth. And the practical implication, given how much public property we have, is that immigrants could be barred from the country because the theory is the government, when it comes to government property, has the same kind of rights as a private property owner, and therefore, just as I can potentially exclude people from my house, even if I don't have a particularly good reason for doing so, so similarly, the government can exclude immigrants from public property because it has rights similar to those of a private owner, or alternatively, even if government officials as such don't have those rights, then maybe the majority of the current population has those rights. And there are many problems with this argument. I would just note one, which is that if you buy it, it has horrible totalitarian implications, not just for immigrants, but also for natives. And it particularly has horrible implications if you're a libertarian and you advocate the right to do many unpopular things. So if the government has the same kind of rights over public property as private owners have over private property, then, for instance, the government can say, we don't want libertarian publications and literature to be distributed using public property. We don't want any drugs or food substances or other products that we don't like to be distributed using public property. If you're a libertarian and you favor drug legalization, as I would assume all or nearly all libertarians do, that's bad news. Or even if you just favor, legalizing certain medicines or certain food products and the like that the majority doesn't like, that's bad news. Similarly, if I'm a private property owner, I can say only Christian religious services will be allowed in my house or only Muslim ones. And similarly, the government could say, Jews are not allowed to travel on public property, or Muslims are not, or Christians are not, and so on. If you don't like same-sex relationships, you could say nobody in a same-sex relationship could travel on the roads, or nobody could travel on the roads for the purpose of engaging in same-sex sexual relations or a same-sex relationship. I can go on, but for anybody, I think for any liberal of any kind, whether you're a libertarian or not, this is a nightmare, but it's even more of a nightmare for libertarians because we favor the right to do all sorts of unpopular things. And if the government can exclude from the public property also anything that majority public opinion doesn't like, then that's obviously contrary to libertarian principles. Maybe your answer is all of this should be privatized. And I'm not quite as radical as some libertarians, but I do agree a lot of currently public property should be privatized. But at the very least, in the meantime, you should not favor a theory under which the currently existing public property can be used in essentially in a kind of totalitarian way to exclude anything that political majorities or the people in power don't like. That will have awful implications going beyond immigration. Now, that doesn't mean the government should never put any restrictions whatsoever on the use of public property. And if you're interested in this, Chris Fryman, a libertarian political theorist, and we have separately written on the topic of how you can potentially have restrictions on the use of public property, which are related to the reasons why that property is public in the first place. So, for
Yeah,
instance,
like a school.
So, for instance, you can restrict people from disrupting classes in a public school, and that can apply whether the disruptors are immigrants or natives or anybody else. Similarly, on a public road, you can impose restrictions to prevent congestion, such as peak toll pricing, or restrictions to prevent dangerous or drunk driving. And there can be borderline cases where you can debate should we impose a particular restriction or not, given the purposes for which the property is public. But what should be out of bounds, at least from any libertarian point of view, or really any non-totalitarian viewpoint, is the idea that the government can impose any restrictions on public property, so long as a private owner of property could impose similar restrictions on the use of his or her own property, because that has awful implications, and it particularly has awful implications for anyone who, like libertarians, favors the right to do various things that are very unpopular.
The argument seems to me not so much to be rational as a rationalization, as if somebody doesn't want immigrants coming into the country, specifically coming over the southern border, so they concocted a justification
Yeah,
for a
I think there's a
viewpoint that
lot
they
of that
already
going
had.
on, but I think it's an attempt to square a circle. That on the one hand, if you're committed to libertarian principles, you support private property rights and freedom of association, which means that natives who own property, or really anybody who owns property, should be allowed to have immigrants on their land if they want to, and they should be allowed to hire immigrants or
Right.
form relationships with them, and the like. And so this argument tries to get around that by saying we're not restricting private property, we're just restricting public property. But public property, if the power over public property goes to this extent, then it's a recipe for essentially a totalitarian state.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier that so far, Governor Abbott hasn't disobeyed federal authorities. But
Yes.
there's a real chance that it can come to that. How does that get resolved constitutionally? If he
Yeah.
simply refuses to let, say, border agents cut down this wire, or he refuses to let them do anything on, his land, what happens? Not on his land, I mean on Texas
Sure.
land.
So as a legal matter, courts, the federal government could go to court, courts could issue additional injunctions, they can impose fines and other sanctions. In addition, it's possible, depending on exactly what he or other state officials do, there could be criminal prosecutions. Setting aside purely legal consideration, thinking about practical ones, obviously a situation where federal and state authorities clash directly, like say, federal troops clash with state officials or the like, that could be a very dangerous situation, reminiscent of what happened during school desegregation, where the President Eisenhower eventually had to federalize the National Guard in I think in Alabama, in order to prevent their obstructing school desegregation. Biden could potentially similarly federalize the Texas National Guard and bring them under his own authority. And I think he would have the legal authority to do so if Texas directly confronted and acted to prevent the enforcement of federal law. My hope, however, is that things will not rise to that level, and we are not there yet.
I see a lot of talk about secession, that Texas could secede from the Union. Now, I thought that this had already been resolved with the Civil War, but there's a lot of talk about it. Practically and constitutionally, is there any chance of this actually occurring, or what are the obstacles?
So I would say a couple things, and if you want to know more, I recently have a review of a book by Christopher Zern, who's an advocate of the breakup of the USA, left-wing advocate, not a right-wing one, but he nonetheless advocates secession and breakup. And I point out some of the legal and practical issues. On the legal side, the Constitution actually does not clearly state either that secession is permitted or that it's forbidden. Does, I think, as a matter of first principles, there are decent legal arguments on both sides. You can argue that the Civil War resolved this issue, but of course, might doesn't necessarily make right. So you can always argue, well, maybe Abraham Lincoln was wrong, at least on the secession issue, and Jefferson Davis was right, and so on.
Which is my personal opinion. I
Okay.
personally
So
think they had
so
the right
I
to
so I think there are
secede.
problems with that, but it's not implausible given the Constitution's silence on the issue. As a practical matter, however, there would be severe obstacles, such as that If Texas or any state did try to secede, there would be a very large minority within that state who would be opposed to it, maybe even a majority, depending on the situation. Something like 45 or 46% of Texas voters voted for Biden in the 2020 election. I suspect the vast majority of those people would not support Texas secession. I think some Texas Republicans also would not support it, even if Abbott was in favor. So you would have a severe potential for conflict, both within the state of Texas and between Texas and the federal government. I think as a practical matter, given the many obstacles and problems, I think it's unlikely that Texas or any state will actually seriously try to secede anytime soon. However, it's a bit less unlikely now than such things have usually been in recent decades. And you see with the attention that Christopher Zern's book and other works got that, the issue of secession and breakup of the U.S. has been discussed in a more serious way in recent years than in the past. I think I'm not in principle opposed to all secession. I think sometimes secession can be justified. For instance, the secession of the Baltic states from the former Soviet Union was well justified, and that of Ukraine and other states as well, because the Soviet Union was a horrible tyranny. By contrast, it is not clear to me that any plausible secession from the U.S. That is currently envisioned would actually result in more and better protection of libertarian rights or any kind of human rights than we would get otherwise. And also the breakup of the United States would be a gift to the authoritarian powers in the world like Russia and China. They would have a much stronger position in the international system. And in fact, Russian propagandists have been talking up the possibility of Texas secession recently. And as a general rule, if Vladimir Putin and his government are in favor of what you're doing, that means there's at least a good chance that what you're trying to do is probably wrong. I admit that just as even a broken clock is right twice a day, so very occasionally something that Putin wants might actually be good, but in general the odds are strongly against it.
Yeah, to me, secession, I'm with you. According to first principles, I don't really have an issue with it, but it just seems dumb in the sense like, if, like you said, so if the idea is that if you're going to be a part of a country, you have to give your consent. So then Texas secedes, but what about the people in Texas that don't consent? So
Yeah.
now you've got a problem there. And for the libertarians out there that I keep hearing say this, what state do they think is going to secede and create a libertarian society? Because there's none that I know of. Texas sure as hell isn't going to do it.
Yeah, so I think it's very clear that if you believe that the only legitimate governments are those that have unanimous consent, no government is legitimate in that sense today, and no state that might secede from the U.S., whether a liberal one like California or a conservative one like Texas, would have that kind of unanimous consent. So to my mind, the way you judge these governments and the way you judge secession movements in the real world is not by principles of unanimous consent, because they don't exist either for the current government or for any plausible secessionist government, but rather by whether the result on net would lead to better protection of human freedom and human welfare than existed before, or worse. And I think it's highly likely that any remotely plausible breakup of the United States would lead to a worse result as opposed to a better one. Even if you can imagine hypothetical situations where someone secedes to create a libertarian utopia, that's not what would be at all likely to happen if Texas were to secede, or for that matter, if California were to do so, or New England, or whatever region or state you posit. The existence of the U.S. and the current Constitution, although it has many flaws, overall I think is good for human freedom in the world, and therefore a breakup of the United States would, under any plausible current circumstances or near future circumstances, would be a net negative for human freedom for a wide range of reasons. I go through some of them in my review of Zern's book, which is available for free online.
This issue of immigration has been a wedge issue as long as I've been paying attention to politics, and nothing ever gets done about it. Where do you see it going legally in the future? Are the legislators going to ever do something, pass immigration reform? Is the court likely to ever come down on our side and say, look, according to our original meaning, the federal government has no authority here? What is likely to happen? Or is it just going to stay an issue so that politicians can get elected on it?
So on the political side, a lot depends on the outcome of obviously the upcoming 24 election and other elections in the near future. It depends on who controls Congress. In particular, obviously, if Trump were to become president, we would expect more cruel restrictionist policies of all kinds, most of them through executive action rather than through legislation, but we would see them if Biden were to win. I think there's at least somewhat more hope for reforms in Biden, although I certainly don't agree with all of his policies in this area. He has done a lot on the positive side to make legal migration easier through various programs, and we might well get more of that in a second term if he were to win. This is one of several reasons why I think he's a lesser evil compared to Trump, even though he certainly has many flaws and many bad policies. More generally, we are at a point now uh, where immigration is what scholars call a valence issue between the two parties. That is a major issue that separates the parties, but it hasn't always been that way in the past, and it may not always be that way in the future. I would add also that if either through executive action or through legislation or some combination thereof, we can make legal migration easier, in addition to other benefits, that would also have the benefit of reducing pressure at the border, because most of the people crossing the border are people who are fleeing horrible conditions, but their only way to get to the US is to do so illegally because there's not a legal pathway available to them. If more legal pathways were made available to more people, that would be beneficial for the immigrants and for the American economy, but it would also reduce pressure at the border, much like the abolition of alcohol prohibition in 1933, I'm sorry, massively reduced illegal smuggling of alcohol across the border, because given the choice, it's for most consumers, they'd rather buy alcohol legally than buy it from Al Capone or other smugglers and criminals. And similarly, most potential migrants, given the choice, they would rather get in legally and have legal work permits than try and take the risk of sneaking across illegally and then having to work in the black market economy. My hope is that that can be done in the future, but I admit it's a difficult political challenge, and I admit the fact that this is a valence issue that divides the parties, that makes it more difficult to deal with, in addition to sort of other dysfunctions that we have in Congress and in the executive branch. So I certainly don't claim that there's a politically easy solution, though I do think there are a bunch of things that can be done that are relatively easy in terms of actual policy implementation. That it's not actually that hard to make legal migration easier. It doesn't require enormous expertise. It doesn't require a super powerful, highly competent bureaucracy. It just requires a loosening up of various bureaucratic and other rules that currently exist.
Okay, Professor Somin, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this very important issue. Where can people find you? I know you write for a blog. I can't remember, the
Sure.
Volkov something, but go ahead
So
and
it
tell
is
them.
it is the Volokh Conspiracy, Volokh, which is available at the Reason Magazine website for free. In addition, if you just Google me, you can come up with my website, which has a lot of my writings for free, including writings about the issues of immigration and invasion and other questions. Or if you like, you can just simply Google my name, immigration, invasion. You can see what I wrote about that. Finally, I have a book called Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, which discusses more broadly a lot of issues related to freedom of movement, and in particular to international migration, though also freedom of movement within countries as well.
Thank you very much, sir. And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.